So it's my pleasure tonight to introduce our keynote speaker. Dr. Maya Shetreat is an integrative pediatric neurologist with a medical degree from Albert Einstein College of Medicine. She's board certified in adult and child neurology as well as pediatrics. She completed the University of Arizona's 2-year fellowship in integrative medicine and now serves on the faculty. She lectures internationally to medical professionals and lay people on environmental health and toxins and healing with food and nature. She lectures children's health education and the importance of time in nature, botanical medicine, biodiversity, and the relationship between health and the natural world. She's the author of the book, The Dirt Cure, Healthy Food, Healthy Gut, Happy Child, which has been translated into 10 languages. A parent herself, she encountered the limits of conventional medicine when her son suffered a severe episode of asthma on his first birthday and began a backward slide in his development. Treatments failed to reverse his condition, so Dr. Shetreat embarked on a scientific investigation, discovering that food was at the root of her son's illness, affecting his digestive system, immune system, and brain. The solution she found was shockingly simple: heal the food, heal the gut, heal the brain, and heal the child. She's going to talk to us about her very important work, so please help me welcome Dr. Maya Shetreat.
Thank you. So thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Interestingly, that story about my son, what I didn't include in the book actually was that his reactivity to food and that whole journey kind of came from actually a mold exposure. So as with, I think, many of the practitioners here and many practitioners who treat people for mold, many times it starts in their own lives with their own health or someone in their families. And I just want to say a word about really the work that I do and how I got involved in speaking about dirt and really nature as a way of treating people. So my practice, I see people from all over the world, as many of you do, and what I discovered is that my whole practice was filled with canaries, the canaries in the coal mine, right? And these are the most sensitive people. And you know what my work has really become now is kind of learning about and teaching them about the gifts that they have because they're sensitive, but at the same time, many times the reason that they have come to me is because they've been compromised in some way. And because of the fact that we have evolved over thousands of years with the natural world, my experience became that using nature as a way of treating was actually something that's very familiar to their bodies and was a way of gently treating people who were really compromised. So I always like to start just by taking a moment to think about what does a healthy person look like. And close your eyes for a second, but I know you're eating, but you could close your eyes for a second and just kind of picture what does a really healthy person look like. And I think what's really difficult is either when we're seeing very chronically ill people or even just in our society right now, what we see a lot of is kind of compromised people walking around and we call them healthy. So I can see people in my practice or in general, I mean, I can see them in my neighborhood who have, asthma and eczema and constipation and, a whole long laundry list of symptoms and they call themselves healthy. So I think what's really critical is for us to really be thinking, obviously we're thinking about recovery and we're thinking, when people have a severe mold illness or mold-related illness, we want to get them better, but also have in mind where we want to end up optimally. So I think the key here, and we're going to get into the science of this, is, often I'll ask a room full of doctors, what is health? And they can't come up with anything better than the absence of disease. So it's not just the absence of disease, right? And it's not just a reflection of whether or not we're actually facing stressors, right? Or showing symptoms, because some of the sickest people that I see they might never have fevers, they might never come down with infections, but they're quite compromised in other ways, neurologically or otherwise. And it's not just obviously based on lab results, right? So health really manifests as resilience. And resilience is basically just the ability to bounce back. Or like, as we would say, right, homeostasis, the ability to stay in balance. Because stressors are inevitable. And you could even argue stressors are necessary, and I will argue, that stressors are necessary to build resilience. And I think in a lot of cases, because we actually spend a lot of time avoiding stressors in certain ways, it actually compromises the immune systems. And I certainly see that in children. And I think we're seeing those children growing up into adults now, and we're seeing them also compromised because it's sort of like we're so afraid of exposing them to things. And here I'm not necessarily speaking of, mold, but just in general, exposing them to the natural world and exposing them to their environment, that it's sort of like, when you want someone to learn how to play the violin, you don't go slap their hand away every time they're going to play the violin, and you don't hire someone else to come in and play the violin for them. They have to kind of do the hard work of showing up and having that kind of stressor, but that ultimately is going to lead to something better. So my argument here is chronic disease actually is what results from a lack of resilience. And the science here is really based, I think, largely in this idea of the cell danger response. And this is Bob Navio's work from UC San Diego, and he does mitochondrial metabolic research. So he talks about the cell danger response as an evolutionarily conserved metabolic response that protects cells and hosts from harm. And basically it's triggered by encounters, chemical, physical, biological, I would add emotional as well, different kinds of threats or challenges that exceed cellular capacity for homeostasis. So small stressors, okay. Larger stressors may not be okay. But what happens then is cell danger response goes into effect where all kinds of different physiologic and cellular mechanisms shift so that you're functioning at a less optimal level. And we could think of it as, right, the flu. Part of what's happening when someone has the flu is there's actually a virus, and that's causing its own issues. But then on top of that, cells actually are diverting resources, right? So the things like the fatigue and the brain fog and other things that happen with flu are really related to this cell danger response. But ultimately, the danger should be eliminated or neutralized. And then there's a whole sequence of anti-inflammatory regenerative pathways that are going to activate, reverse the cell danger response, and then healing begins. But sometimes the cell danger response persists abnormally. And when that's the case, whole body metabolism, gut microbiome, and multiple organ systems all continue to function in a compromised way, and that's where chronic disease arises. And we see this in the brain through the activation of microglia. So how many people here are familiar with microglia? Okay, so I'm gonna just outline it. Basically, right, microglia are immune cells that live in the brain. And they're really more than that. They're nurse cells to neurons, and they're in a 3-to-1 ratio to neurons. So we think of neurons as the stars of the brain, but actually microglia are doing tremendous amount of support for every neuron. And what happens is that they're doing the nurse cell thing, taking care of the neurons, and then something activates them, immunologically typically, but it could also be in other ways. And those nurse cells basically go mama bear, okay? So we have these activated microglia, and they start to release inflammatory cytokines, they start to release chemokines, and that increases, kind of kicks up like glutamate production and firing inappropriately in the brain, and it creates a whole pathway of this acute microglial activation that has free radical generation, mitochondrial dysfunction, and what we call immunoexcitotoxicity. But then, what we hope is that the microglia are going to switch into reparative mode, right? They're going to go back into that nurse cell mode after the threat has been neutralized. And in that case, what happens is that anti-inflammatory cytokines are released, and actually all these nice kind of yummy neurotrophic factors will be released as well to increase plasticity with things like BDNF and so on. And that's kind of the model that we see, is this activated microglia. And in fact, activated microglia has been implicated in, I could give you 60 or 100 or more slides on all the different disorders, from psychiatric disease, all kinds of different psychiatric diseases. And I put that in there because I feel like we spend so much time kind of, I don't think in this room we do, but as a medical establishment, we spend a lot of time dismissing kind of psychiatric disease as basically, I feel like it's like a medication deficit, right? But actually, it's very clearly linked to microglial activation, among other things. But also in things like TBI and stroke, autism, Tourette's, OCD, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, ALS, ADHD, and so on. Okay, so microglial activation is kind of like really what's underlying tremendous number of chronic neurological illnesses, and it's definitely triggered by immune activation. So how do you recover from this chronic cell danger response? So I think the way I would start, and how I do start when I'm working with someone who has a mold exposure or another kind of toxic exposure for that matter, is thinking about hormesis and the concept of hormesis, which has been really misused a lot by, like, you know, let's say the pesticide industry or other chemical industry, saying, oh, well, don't worry because this is just a little bit of a heavy metal or a little bit of a pesticide. But the idea of hormesis is that you have this phenomenon where there can be a beneficial effect, whether it be improved health or stress tolerance or growth or longevity, whatever it may be, that results from an exposure in a very low dose to something that otherwise could be toxic or even lethal at a higher dose. So I think like the easiest way to maybe think of that is like fasting, right? Because we're hearing a lot about intermittent fasting and doing, let's say, a day or 24 hours, 48 hours of fasting once a month, something like that. But if you fast for a month, right? So maybe there could be a benefit if you do it, let's say overnight for extra time, or you do it for 24 hours. But if you fast for a month, you're going to have a different kind of outcome. So most of us think, again, maybe or maybe not in this room, that, it's kind of like a linear thing, right? So there's a linear no threshold model where, the dose starts low, the risk is low, the dose gets high, the risk is high, but there's really no beneficial effect in there. Whereas with hormesis, what's seen is that there's actually this little spike of benefit at a very low level of stress. So, and then we have, and I think a lot of us who are working with these super sensitive people know that we have this hypersensitive response, right? Responses can look really different. We can see something like that linear no threshold response that's just that straight line. We see the hormetic response, and then we see also the hypersensitive response. But essentially what hormesis does is it's a stressor in a way. The concept of hormesis is a little bit of stress causes essentially our mitochondria and our cells to step up and function more optimally. And this happens in a lot of different ways, which I'm going to get to. We can trigger it in a lot of different ways. So obviously, I don't think I have to say after a whole day of lectures and all the work that people here are doing that there's a very significant pro-inflammatory response that can come from things like mold spores and mycotoxins like aflatoxin and so on. But we know it's turning on microglia, and there's clear, I'm always amazed when I look in the literature at how limited the literature is on mold exposure. I feel like it's there, but you have to do a lot of kind of investigating to look. It's not something always so easy to find. But the inflammatory response is clear and clearly outlined. So we're going to work our way to the specific treatments, and I'm going to kind of throw those in as I talk about dirt. And why do I talk about dirt? Because I think it is the foundation of resilience and health. And that's because, so when I'm talking about dirt, I'm talking about exposure to germs and microbes. I'm talking about soil and what grows in it. And I'm talking about time and nature. So starting with germs, part of why I talk about this is because we can be, as I think also as a medical community and even in the functional medicine, integrative health community, there's such a very powerful desire to kind of think of microbes as germs and think of like we need to use medications to kind of kill these guys. And so people will sometimes say, what's the difference between a germ and a microbe? And my answer is basically a germ is just a pejorative term for microbe. So, you know, because we're learning more and more and more, and I'll be presenting this to you, that actually germs are very often working in a synergistic way with the immune system and keeping it healthy. So I think most of us are pretty familiar now with the idea of the microbiome, right? The 3 to 5 pounds of microbes of all kinds that live in and on our body. And it turns out there are probably, just if we look at kind of percentages, you know, by DNA, there's much less of us than there are of microbes. And these microbes are modulating things like brain development and function and behavior. Things like gut physiology, which might seem more obvious, but linking that also to behavioral abnormalities, let's say in autism. And in fact, actually, in certain ways, modulating the progression of multiple sclerosis. So what was found in this study is that people with MS had a different makeup of bacterial species in their gut than people who didn't have MS, and that those microbes actually correlated with changes in the activity of genes that were modulating the immune system. So there's a very intimate relationship between the microbes in our guts, on our skin, and elsewhere, and the function of our immune system, whether it's overactive, underactive, and generally in balance. And what in this study they found is that as the therapies were given in MS, the gut microbiome seemed to normalize. And it's thought possibly, as you know, more studies are being done now, but it's thought that possibly that is the mechanism of how some of these medications are helping, part of the mechanism. And we know obviously too that the microbiome, well, we know that diet is connected to epigenetics and developing cancer and things like that, but in fact the gut microbiome now has been shown to be a very important modulator in that. So, and we also have clear evidence now that and I think many of us have suspected or known this for some time, that microbes are very pivotal in the connection through the immune system, so in the kind of triggering and progression and modulating of neurodegenerative diseases. And so those are like many of these people that we're seeing come to our practices who are coming with neurologic conditions and having compromised immune systems potentially from mold and other kinds of triggers. So we have significant challenges to our microbiome. Our flora is different than it was. And it's changing and changing, but obviously antibiotics have made a huge difference. C-section has made a huge difference, not just at the time of birth, but actually long term. So when a baby's born or when a baby's born vaginally, the baby seeds its gut with vaginal flora. That's how it seeds its microbiome. Does anybody know what the gut is seeded with if they're born by C-section? Skin, right? So skin flora is the predominant flora. And what's seen in those babies is, obviously it's not a sentence and it's not written in stone, but their risk of developing autoimmune conditions or allergies and having basically immunomodulated issues are higher, right? Same thing with breastfeeding versus formula feeding. And there's a lot of reasons that this happens, which I'm not going to get into right now, but it does change the way the gut functions and it changes the way the immune system functions. Certainly for the time that they're breastfeeding, that we know for sure, and probably for much longer. Chronic use of antibiotics, which can start from birth but continue through childhood. I have people who come to me and I say, how often are you on antibiotics? And they say, no more than normal, no more than everybody else. And I'm like, okay, well, how many times? And they're like, oh, like maybe 3 to 5 times a year. So I say, well, okay, what if I told you some people never take antibiotics ever? And they're like, oh, you know, it's like there's a really, and it's kind of coming from both sides. I mean, physicians are doing it and patients are asking for it still. I think it's becoming maybe a little bit better, but I think it's very much something that we're guilty of in the alternative medicine, let's say integrative, functional, however we want to call it, communities, that there's a lot of antibiotic use still. And because we're now having a sense, really from a vast amount of science that's just growing and growing and growing literally daily, of how the microbial community is so pivotal for the function of the immune system and the brain, we really cannot afford to be in any way cavalier or even aggressive with antibiotics unless we are absolutely against a wall. Things like acetaminophen, ibuprofen, steroids are influencing the microbiome, as are vaccines, and I'll kind of get into that for just a second, and other kinds of pharmaceuticals. We know that these influence the microbiome in different ways. And so in some ways, we just need to know more. We don't have a lot of data, but it's likely. Processed food, right? I mean, the basic answer is the more diverse your diet, the more diverse your microbiome. And the more diverse your microbiome, the healthier your immune system. So processed food is kind of the enemy of having a diverse microbiome, and therefore it actually contributes to having an immune system that's not in balance. Pesticides like Roundup, which is the most widely used pesticide right now in this country on pretty much 100% of conventional soy and corn, and most wheat. Actually, with wheat, it's sprayed on the wheat right before it's harvested so that it releases the seed and they get a higher harvest count. So there's a high trace of Roundup on a lot of conventional wheat as well. And the thing is that there's a lot of issues, which I do cover in my book, on just the glyphosate. But Roundup initially was patented as an antibiotic. So what we're basically doing is giving chronic traces of antibiotics to people who are eating conventional diets, which is most people, and that's influencing also the diversity and content really of their microbiome. And then too much time indoors, and I think most of us, I mean, how many people feel like, let's say, their kids spend as much time outdoors as you did as a kid? Anybody feel like that's true? Yeah, so me either. And I really try, but we'll get to that. So yeah, well, and there's a lot of dangers from being outdoor, and I'm not going to just totally, I'm not being totally glib about it. But we've kind of demonized the outdoors, and the thing is, as I'm going to get to, that the outdoors is actually an incredibly important way that we diversify our microbiome, among many other things. So our health paradigm right now is avoid, 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 avoid. Like, don't go near this, don't go near that, stop this, don't go there, everything's bad. And I see it even if I'm talking about soil and dirt and nature, is people are scared to go outside because of sun, because soil could be toxic, there could be lead in the soil, there could be mold in the soil, there could be parasites in the soil, there could be, someone could be climbing a tree and they could fall the tree, there could be deer and there could be ticks and there could be limes. So we've created this situation where basically the world, which nourishes us in every way and has since the beginning of time, has become kind of an enemy, or we regard it in that way, and that is really leading to us becoming more chronically ill versus the other way around, ultimately. Because here's the thing: we thought we were going to come up with the gene or the one medication that was going to be the magic bullet. We were going to figure out chronic illness. We were going to figure out autism, or we were going to figure out Alzheimer's or MS or any of these things. And honestly, that's to date not happened. Billions and billions and billions of dollars of research later. But what we do know, and what comes up again and again and again and again, is that biodiversity, if anything, is the magic bullet. It's biodiversity, and that's what we need. And the biodiversity of our bodies comes from our terrain. So germ theory versus cellular theory. this is actually, I think, really important because, so germ theory came from our good friend Louis Pasteur, the father of pasteurization, right? Who basically, kind of said, well, there are these microscopic organisms that are kind of essentially like laying in wait, ready to invade us at any time, and that can cause disease and possibly kill us. I mean, I don't know if he'd approve of that summary, but and what happened with that is that we started to really demonize microbes because we didn't really know very much about them. And at the time, when I say demonized, it actually got to the point that people stopped eating yogurt and sourdough bread because it was considered to be contaminated. So there was, Louis Pasteur had a colleague who was around at the same time, Claude Bernard. And Claude Bernard talked about the cellular theory, which was that most microbial diseases are caused by organisms that are present in the body of a normal individual. And they become the cause of disease when a disturbance arises, which upsets the equilibrium of the body. Well, now that we know about the microbiome, right, and we know that a lot of, like, let's say, common bacteria that can cause infections or even viruses live in our body all the time, this makes a lot of sense, right? That really it's the host, the health of the host. And I think in environmental medicine, we know this, that it's the health of the host that matters. Like, why does one person get exposed to something and they get a little bit like sick, and another person, nothing happens, and another person is totally debilitated, and another person dies? Why? It's the same trigger, because it's the host. It's the host and the balance of the body and the systems of the body of the host. And we are starting to acknowledge this. Our paradigm is changing. So imagine 20 years ago, someone going to their doctor and saying, I'm taking 5 billion units or colonies of bacteria every day in a pill on purpose, right? I mean, they would have, like, the person would have been laughed out of the office or worse. But now, obviously, probiotics, I mean, even when I started in practice, I was like the crazy neurologist in this big mainstream practice that I started in who prescribed probiotics to all my patients who came in with like any kind of chronic illness. And the GI in that practice, the pediatric GI, because I was in the kind of the peds section, was so contemptuous of probiotics. She tried to make me out as such a lunatic. I ended up leaving that practice, needless to say, after a couple of years. And as soon as I left, the patients who followed me, guess what they told me? Oh, the GI prescribes probiotics all the time now, right? So it's like you're never a hero in your own hometown. But the data was there, right? The data was there, and it has only been growing. She never apologized. What about, so the microvirome? Anyone aware of the microvirome? So I'm going to talk about that in a second. This is kind of amazing stuff, and oncolytic viruses. So I'm going to get to that. Soil-based organisms. So we're actually starting to see probiotics that are derived from the soil. And in fact, the new categories even of antibiotics are being derived from the soil. And who's heard of psychobiotics? Anybody? So there is a huge literature now growing. If you're going to have, we could go to PubMed after this, right? But there's a very big body of literature now growing on certain kinds of microbes that are directly treating anxiety, depression, and other kinds of psychiatric illness. And this is just through basically a certain kind of probiotic. So that's been building for a long time, but now pharmaceutical companies are in it and developing them, and they're coming to market probably pretty soon. Nematode therapy. We know what that is, intestinal worms, right? For those who don't know, using those on purpose to treat people's immunologic conditions. I'm going to talk about that for a minute. Fecal transplant, everyone heard of that, right? So, and fecal transplant, which is exactly, for anyone who doesn't know, it's exactly what it sounds like. You're taking pills or enemas that have feces in them as a way of treating, basically rebuilding the immune system in order to fight severe infections. And possibly many other conditions. But right now, what's happening in academic centers around the world is that people who have Clostridium difficile, which is an aggressive bacteria that's found in people who have been overtreated with antibiotics, who are immunosuppressed, and many people who are elderly can contract C. diff. And basically, it's very resistant to a lot of antibiotics in many cases. And people really die from this. So recently, there was a study even, I think it was in Sweden, where they actually stopped the study because it was considered unethical to not use fecal transplant to treat the people with C. diff. It was so life-saving. So this is like an example, right? I mean, what could be more biodiverse than feces? And that's really like where we are right now. I think like, sorry, because I know it's dinner time, but I mean, you know, I'm not the one who wrote the schedule. And vaginal microbial transfer. So vaginal microbial transfer is another, you know, basically the idea of taking vaginal secretions from the mom and kind of rubbing them on the baby's face and in their mouth when they're born by C-section as a way to try to counteract what's going on with the skin flora. And in fact, those are all happening in academic centers right now, all of these things. So people have probably heard of the hygiene hypothesis, which was that, you know, kids who grow up on farms essentially were 30 to 50% less likely to get asthma. So everyone said, great, it's because they're dirty, people need to get dirty, and it's just like a lot more microbes, that's why. Those kids are healthier. So there were researchers who went, measured the microbes in an urban apartment and on a traditional farm. And it turned out the number of microbes were the same. So that wasn't the reason, but what was the reason? Types, right? So diversity of microbes was tremendously higher on the farm as compared to in an urban apartment. So biodiversity, biodiversity, biodiversity. Our immune systems are social, okay? We think of them as these armies and warriors. I always hear them talked about in this kind of like warlike way. But in fact, they're social information processing systems, and they want to meet and greet many different kinds of compounds and foods and microbes and all the different things, and so that they're familiar. And then they're a lot less likely to react improperly. Whereas if they don't see very many different things, then something's going to come along, trigger it, and then it's going to go completely haywire because it's paranoid, and it thinks like, for sure this is an enemy. Even if it's not an enemy, even if it's not something it needs to react to in that way. So having biodiversity helps the immune system learn how to modulate itself. And it basically is like a form of hormesis. Okay? It's like practicing the violin so that when the big concert comes, it can get up on stage and like play the concerto or whatever. Viruses. So the microvirome, this came out in Nature a few years ago, where basically we know, right, most of us here know germ-free mice, okay, have been treated heavily with antibiotics. And this happens to us too, that basically when we have antibiotics, we have gut breakdown. The physiology changes, the immune response changes, we have interferon expression that's different. Basically, our guts miss the microbes. They want them, okay? And what happened here is that in these mice, some of them were treated with a benign virus prior to, or along with being kind of treated with the heavy antibiotics. Guess what happened? Nothing. Germ-free mice had no issues whatsoever that they would normally have without having a biodiverse microbiome. The viruses mimicked the effect of commensal bacteria in the gut. So what does that mean? Right? Because so far we've been willing to say, well, bacteria, maybe some bacteria are good. Maybe not all, but some. But viruses, no. Viruses, yes. Maybe viruses actually are very important in our microbiome and even in our immune system. So this comes from a paper which started, the first paper I saw was an association paper. People who have had mumps are half as likely to develop ovarian cancer later in life, okay? And I remember posting it on Facebook, and I got a lot of like, well, that's just an association, that's meaningless. Like, okay, fine. So then this paper came out, and not surprisingly, basically, there's an antigen which, is on mumps and is similar to that on ovarian cancer cells. And as probably most of us here know, we always make cancer cells all the time in our bodies, and our immune systems, when they're healthy and in balance, are constantly taking care of that. It's basically a balance. It's a balance, okay? Because it's just part of the way our physiology goes. This basically is like giving the immune system a cue. Like, these ovarian cancer cells are not going to be good. And we know that because of the mumps. We remember that. So this doesn't mean like, I think everyone should run out and get the mumps. I'm just saying that viruses do have a way of working with our immune system and modulating the health and balance of the immune system. And it's something that we are going to have to, at some point, be able to talk about and confront. All politics and others aside, we need to be able to talk about the science. And we need to be able to ask good questions and do good research that can help us answer these questions. Oncolytic measles viruses that have that have been slightly modified, are injected now into glioblastoma multiforme, very severe brain cancer that's very hard to treat, pancreatic cancer, other kinds of hard to treat solid tumors, and they're seeing benefit. They're seeing, in some cases, the tumor completely regress. So this is something, again, that we have to really rethink our relationship, the relationship of viruses, our microbiome and microvirome, and the immune system. And this is also important because if we're trying to recover someone, let's say from mold or any number of other kinds of conditions where they've been triggered into this cell danger response, we need to know what to do to get them back in balance. What I see so often is that medications after medications after medications after medications are rained down on them. And these are very sensitive people. And sometimes little things can go a long way. Now, I'm certainly not as senior as many people in this room who are, who have been doing this a long time. And so obviously I think all know that there are some people where we really have to pull out all the stops in order to help them. But I think what we haven't done in medicine as we could, and this is because we haven't been trained to do it, is that we're not using really the innate natural resources of the earth, basically, to help modulate the immune system and help modulate recovery. I'm going to kind of speed through parasites because I want to get to the rest of it. But essentially, what we know is that, and what we're seeing now is there are many academic studies now going on where people are being infected on purpose in academic centers with intestinal worms to help basically reverse their autoimmunity. And this is in colitis, in Crohn's, and in other conditions. And it turns out that among many things, having parasites in the gut actually help gut morphology, actually seem to help with increased gut and impaired gut permeability. So there's some interesting studies too, which I'm not going to get into too much, but it turns out that, let's say in this Aboriginal community, where they compared people who had previous infection with strongyloides, an intestinal worm. The ones who had prior infection versus the ones who hadn't were 61% less likely to develop type 2 diabetes. And that was adjusted for age, triglycerides, blood pressure, BMI. I mean, at least they tried to do a good job of getting rid of those confounding factors. And again, with type 1 diabetes, if you look in the top in A, you'll see that the red area is basically where there's an increased incidence of type 1 diabetes. Where there's red in B on the bottom is where there is a high amount of endemic parasite infection. So interesting that there's a mirror image there. And in this study that was done by a group of gastroenterologists, what they said in looking at patients with inflammatory bowel disease is seems that the relationship between humans and nematodes of the gastrointestinal tract can be considered as a mutualism rather than a typical parasitism. I mean, I don't know about you, but when I read this, my brain basically exploded, right? Because parasites, I mean, the whole concept of parasite is a one-sided relationship, and it's damaging to the other guy, right? But in this case, what they're saying is, I think we messed up. There may be a mutualism. Now, again, because sometimes I give this talk, and people will be like, should I go infect myself with a parasite? No. That's not what I'm saying. But as many of you probably know, there are physicians doing this, definitely in Europe. It's happening here in this country too, and not just with, it's not all with, a really aggressive kinds of parasites, but they're using things like TSO, like there's available treatments, and they're being explored in a lot of different conditions, including neuroimmune conditions, because they help modulate the immune system and shut down microglial activation and shut down the cell danger response. Because our bodies crave biodiversity. Interestingly, in this study that was done in people with celiac disease, they actually experimentally infected them with hookworms. Hard to believe, but they did do that and got it by the IRB. And what they found when these patients were infected with hookworms is pre-trial, they found that the diversity of organisms was lower. And if you look post-hookworm, right, in the next one, all those dots are basically increased numbers of different kinds of organisms. So diversity of bacteria increased only with the addition of a hookworm. Diversity begets diversity. You don't even need to solve every problem. It's like a ripple effect, which is like my favorite thing about treating people. I mean, that is the most beautiful thing, is like I can see a lot of things wrong, and it's like about prioritizing a key few things, and then the body wants to heal. And in this case, the body wants nature. The body wants what it's used to being exposed to, what it's evolved to be exposed to over many, many thousands of years. And that is diverse organisms, dirt, nature. So, soil. Basically, we don't, and we haven't, I think, thought very much about soil in general. But 1 teaspoon of soil actually holds as many organisms as people on this planet. I said that on NPR in an interview, and I got a lot of emails from people who are asking me, well, was I including this category of organisms or not? Because it would be many, many more than the number of people on the planet, whatever. Anyway. I love the geeky people who listen to NPR. I am one of those geeky people. But we basically have been ignoring one of the most amazing probiotics that we could possibly be exposing ourselves to, which is outside. And yes, it's true, there can be organisms there we don't want to be exposed to. Yes, it's true, there can be heavy metals. And I mean, if it's your soil and your place, I test my soil when I move to a new place and I'm going to garden and grow there. I do. I send it in to be tested for heavy metals and other things because I like to know that. And sometimes it needs to be remediated. There are ways to do that. And I think we should all get much more engaged rather than running away. Like, you wouldn't run away from a person you love if they were sick or toxic. You would engage, you would be there for them, right? We're not doing that for the earth, and the earth is literally nourishing us. I mean, this isn't like spiritual woo-woo talk, it is, right? It's right there. So I think we need to be thinking about that, because it's sort of as like I got my ire up that people will say, well, I want to stay away from nature, stay away from the soil because it could make me sick. Well, then go fix it. If you spray Roundup in your park, go say something about it, start talking, because this is what nourishes us and what's helping our bodies to be healthy. An estimated 25% of the world's biodiversity is in soil. And I want to mention, actually, that, I kind of didn't touch on this before, but there have been studies done, which maybe you know. So I study with indigenous communities around the world, and I've studied in Ecuador with Quechua people and Warani people, and there have been studies done on actually stool of some indigenous tribes, and their stool is exponentially more biodiverse, exponentially, like there's zero comparison to anyone in the developed world compared to their stool. And they don't get chronic illnesses. I mean, there are reasons they die, but actually, FYI, many of those people live much longer lives than we do. Like the Maasai people, just for instance, who I've had conversations with some of the people in that community and talked about how they live, and they have elders there that live till 105 and 107. So, and they're not even a blue zone. No one went and interviewed them, but they do have elders that live that long, and they live in a way that's very connected to nature, obviously. So, just like dirt itself, what am I using to treat mold, and what are many of us using? I mean, so things like clay, right? Zeolite clay, like binders, activated charcoal, diatomaceous earth, which is silica. So, using these kinds of actual, basically dirt and minerals as a way of binding toxin. These are natural ways. And when I say natural, I'm not saying it because I want to make it sound good, but these are the ways that we as people for a very long time have known how to bind toxins from our body. Now, obviously, when you're using these kinds of things, you have to be careful when you're eating it with food or other things, because it's going to bind your good minerals and things that you need to nourish yourself. But these are actually ways that, and again, I'm not saying this means go out. Someone asked me, is this talk going to be all about eating dirt? Well, this little part is definitely about it. But we do need, and these are ways that we do bind toxins and have even traditionally done it. And these are very effective ways to actually to treat mold. Food. So food is the embodiment of our terrain, right? When we're eating food, we're basically eating sunshine, soil, water, rocks. Anybody know that the roots of plants and the mycorrhizae that live on the roots, basically, when the soil is not mineral rich, the mycorrhizae help basically dissolve rocks by secreting mild acids, and then the roots take it up and make it part of the plant, and that's what you eat. So we're eating all of these different things when we eat plants. And so thinking about soil in this way, it's actually part of what's nourishing us. And since nutritional depletion makes us much more vulnerable to chronic illness, and reserve, right, is key, and nourishment is reserve, so we want really nutrient-dense food. But what I think is really interesting, right, so obviously when we're talking about molds and mold recovery, we're talking about a lot of different things, right? I mean, there's a lot of different kinds of, we want people to be eating good food. We want them to maybe be avoiding certain foods that are mold containing. After the mold exposure that we had in my family, for instance, like I couldn't eat peanuts anymore. I couldn't eat corn anymore. I had a list of things that really bothered me afterwards. Micronutrients that we need. And I want to just mention, obviously, also, again, that I didn't touch on this, but I know it's been touched on quite a lot, that there are things like glutathione or CoQ10 or carnitine, things that are going to support the mitochondria, or things that are going to, liposomal vitamin C, things that are going to be very helpful for mold recovery, are definitely going to be part of this. And when someone's very sick, it's not like I'm just saying eat a bunch of healthy food. Like, we do need, the fats, the fish oils, all these things that are going to be helpful for nourishing and helping the immune system to function better, and the mitochondria to function better. But also diverse phytonutrients. So this is actually a really fascinating way that hormesis happens. So how the red shiniest apple is at the top of the tree? Why do you think so? Right. UV radiation. It's because radiation is a stressor. It's a hormetic stressor. And basically, phytonutrients, which we like to think are for us, like, oh, isn't it so nice that these plants are so healthy for us? But that's not why there are phytonutrients. Phytonutrients are the immune system of the the plant. So phytonutrients basically make the plant, help the plant survive. And when you have a stressor like the sun, like UV radiation, it triggers the plant, the tree, whatever it might be, to produce more phytonutrients. And so those apples, let's say, are going to be redder and shinier and more flavorful and more filled with phytonutrients, which happen to be beneficial for us. Why? Anybody know? I'm going to get to it in a minute. Hormesis, because phytonutrients actually act as toxins in our body, small, tiny hormetic toxins, along with a big dose of nutrients that actually trigger our cells to function more optimally, trigger our mitochondria to function more optimally because of a hormetic response. Phytonutrients are hormesis. I consider microbes to be part of our nutrition. I consider the stem cells and pheromones of the plant to be part of our nutrition. I consider soil, traces of soil that might be like, let's say you're in your garden. Who here grows food? Anybody? So like when you're growing your own food, you're going to probably go outside and like you're going to see something growing and you get excited, right? If anyone like follows me on Instagram, in my story on Instagram, I always like have little like happy things in my garden and I take little videos of like, look what I have today, you know? And like sometimes I take it and I eat it right there. And I'm getting a little dirt, you know, when I do that, but generally I'm not too worried about that. I'm not saying people need to take big mouthfuls of dirt, although that is a thing I feel like that is happening, but we're not gonna go there. What's another form of hormesis? Well, this is another thing, right, is bitters. Does anybody here use a bitter tonic? Anybody? Okay, let's ask another question. Anybody here drink coffee? Raise your hand. Hi, raise a hi. I'm not outing you, don't worry. Coffee is a bitter tonic. It's a bitter plant tonic, okay? And basically, those alkaloids that are in coffee act as bitters. They act in a hormetic way in our bodies and basically cause our mitochondria, again, to step up and function more optimally. If you are not using bitter tonic in yourself or in your patients, I highly recommend that you do because they really affect us on many, many, many levels. We have bitter receptors not just in our mouth, which is like where we always think of having our taste receptors, but actually throughout our GI tract, okay? Including in our liver, our pancreas, our gallbladders, including in our ear, nose, throat, including in our brains. Breasts in women, testicles in men. We have bitter receptors throughout our body. Why? Poisons are bitter, okay? So we need to be ready right away when there's a poison coming in. But remember I said that these alkaloids and even phytonutrients act as tiny toxins. They act as basically little poisons. So what happens? Well, we increase our gut motility. So if you're bloated, you have digestive issues, it's going to move things through more quickly, right? So you don't want to keep the poisons in there too long. It increases stomach acid, which is an important part of our immune system. It enhances our digestion and absorption, basically like increases bile production, stabilizes blood sugar levels, increases liver detoxification. Okay, and we want increased bile production because it's going to help take those mold toxins and other kinds of toxic exposures out of the body, as well as helping us absorb fats, which we need. We need the fat, you know, to have a healthy immune system and healthy brain. It also helps recover, it boosts immunity in the ear, nose, and throat. So it's also helping in that kind of infectious, and so many people who have issues with mold have a lot of ear, nose, and throat issues. So bitters are like basically, they work on so many different levels and they have such benefit. You can get a lot of different products. If you want to ask me after, I can tell you the names of some of the brands that I like. But there's, but also just like dandelion root tea or even chamomile tea is a mild bitter. I use that in children a lot. Coffee, as I said, although I don't recommend necessarily drinking tons of it, but a little bit of coffee can help really, especially if it's the mold toxin-free kind, can be helpful for some people and help stimulate that. I think that's why a lot of people love coffee. We think it's like all about the caffeine, but I think it's actually the alkaloids. And speaking of coffee, I'm just going to mention to the side that, coffee enemas is another way. I don't know and I'm not going to ask if anybody here recommends that or uses them, but I actually do sometimes use them. And I've had patients who had seizure disorder where we've used them for a period of time and the seizures have completely gone away. It's totally mitigated their seizures. Like dramatics. And I've seen it in different kinds of exposures. So the idea of coffee enemas is that they, obviously I don't have slides on this, I'm just throwing it in, but is that it actually, because you're putting the coffee in to the rectum and it's shared splanchnic circulation with the liver, Those alkaloids, the caffeine, which is an alkaloid, is causing vasodilation, and the other alkaloids basically are going to the liver and stimulating the liver to produce more glutathione because, again, of hormesis. And the levels of glutathione can increase by 600 times for the period of time that enema is being held. So if you hold it, right, because the entire volume of the blood goes through the liver in about 5 minutes. So if you hold it for 5 minutes, then basically you're kind of scrubbing the blood once. If you hold it for 10 minutes, twice, and if you do it for 15 minutes, it's 3 times kind of doing that scrubbing. Now, I'm not someone who thinks that it should be done like massively, like there are cancer programs and other things where they do it very aggressively, but it can actually be done once or twice a week and you can actually see real benefit, or even less than that, to be honest with you. But again, that is a hormetic effect. And what I really like is how all of these different ways that kind of we're working with nature, it's actually causing the body to step up on its own in many cases. We're actually like enhancing the body's own kind of inclination to heal. So this is just bitter receptors are, yes, expressed in brain cells. This is talking about the hormetic effects of dietary isothiocyanates in cancer prevention, but also in all prevention, which is just phytonutrients, what I was talking about. So yes, there are papers. This is not, me making it up. There's data. Dandelions I mentioned, chamomile I mentioned. I want to just mention sweeteners. I mean, there are a lot of things obviously about food I could talk about, but I didn't want to, time is limited and I didn't want to spend too much time on that. But just from the point of view of sweeteners, so we do know that, sugar actually dampens the immune system and dampens the function of the immune system. That's why, people who have diabetes are more likely to have all different kinds of difficult to treat infections. However, for me, if I'm having patients who are going to probably, especially because I see probably about 60 to 70% children in my practice, they're probably going to have something sweet occasionally. What I really recommend is looking at sweeteners that have nutrient density. And so things like blackstrap molasses, maple syrup, raw cane sugar, honey, and even brown sugar, although I don't usually recommend that, actually have antioxidant properties. And blackstrap molasses in particular has over 5 times the antioxidant properties of raspberries or blueberries. So it's very, very powerful. And what I kind of had to come to when I saw that was like, well, it's a plant, right? It's just, blackstrap molasses is basically the sugar cane after you've taken out the purified white sugar. It's basically everything healthy was left behind as blackstrap molasses. So for people on a ketogenic diet, it's a problem, or modified Atkins. But for other people, for many of them, they can tolerate it. And even in my book, I have a recipe for how to use it because it is a little strong tasting. And honey, actually, by the way, is being looked at now as a way of shutting down microglial activation. It's been studied. There are papers on this. And it's being looked at now as a way of treating type 1 diabetes. So honey is something I think that's pretty interesting to work with. But the issue with just regular sugar is it stimulates, insulin is a very inflammatory hormone. And at least in the brain, it's a real issue because it's stimulating phospholipase A2, which is dissolving membrane phospholipids, which is obviously like an important component of the cell membrane of neurons and other cells. So we really want to keep insulin really steady, and that is, obviously a reason to kind of mitigate or minimize sugar, but also to use bitter tonic. Fasting, I don't think I need to get into this too much, but again, it's just a hormetic effect, whether it's intermittent fasting or even fasting mimicking. There are benefits from doing that, and I have used that. I don't obviously use it with children, but in adults, and I would say almost across the board, I've seen benefit in my practice, and we work our way up, and we do it in a way that doesn't feel punishing, because I'm a big believer in we don't destroy someone's quality of life to get them better if we can possibly avoid it, because it's a journey that hopefully they can still live their life while they're going through it as much as possible. Herbal remedies, this is touching on it. There's obviously, this could be a whole talk, but looking at things that support lymphatic drainage. Violet is amazing, actually. Violet leaves or flowers. You can get that as a tincture from, I think Herb Farm has it. Red clover, red root cleavers. These are all amazing ways to stimulate lymphatic drainage. And this is obviously really, really important because we're holding on to a lot of different kinds of toxic exposures that's coming from the extracellular space, that's going into the lymphatic system, and a lot of people are not really able to move it well. Liver support, so dandelion, that bitter tonic I mentioned, milk thistle, turmeric, burdock, which burdock you could put like literally in a soup. It's very simple. Rooibos, which is like a South African tea. It's become very popular. All of those are great for liver support. Again, I try to make it as pleasant as possible. Kidney cleansing, nettles, parsley, marshmallow. Immune balancing. So I love, love, love medicinal mushrooms. I don't know if people here have really seen in their mold-sensitive patients an issue. I have not. I have not. People told me I was going to. But I've used reishi in many, many, many people have not seen a problem. And the amazing thing about something like reishi, which if you look in the literature, it could also be called Ganoderma lucidum, is that reishi both stimulates the nonspecific immune system and at the same time calms the more like, Th2 arm of the immune system, that like autoimmune allergic kind of component. Among many other things. I mean, it's mitochondrial support, has the whole anti-aging thing, antiviral, antibacterial. I mean, it's being looked at for treating HIV and hepatitis C virus and Epstein-Barr virus. So reishi for me ends up being a win a lot of times, but there are obviously other immune balancing medicinal mushrooms and CBD, which I'm not going to talk about, but I've seen a lot of good benefit with that as well. Cannabinoids. And then cognitive enhancement. So things that are going to protect the neurons for me, obviously, because I'm treating a lot of people who are coming with neurologic issues. So lion's mane mushrooms, bacopa, gotu kola, which are Ayurvedic herbs, and have been looked at extensively both in children and adults, being used in large doses, long-term, with no adverse effects. I mean, they've been used for thousands of years in Ayurvedic medicine, and they've been shown to be effective for things like ADHD, Alzheimer's. They're being looked at in autism. I use them in people with learning disabilities. I see significant changes in their grades just by changing that, by adding that. And finally, time in nature. So soil organisms make us happy. So Mycobacterium vaccae was looked at in a lot of different ways. In one way, in cancer patients, where it showed improved emotional health, vitality, and cognitive function. It lowered stress in animal studies. And this is kind of this whole psychobiotic thing I was mentioning earlier. But it's become much more than this. This is one particular strain. Where it physiologically and behaviorally showed lower stress levels. And this is my favorite study because basically they fed mice tiny peanut butter sandwiches with Mycobacterium vaccae spread on it. And what they were able to do, they called a superhero effect. Okay? They navigated a difficult maze twice as fast, and they exhibited half the anxiety behaviors as the mice who didn't get the peanut butter sandwich that had the Mycobacterium. And they needed to get it every 3 weeks or so, okay? And these are soil organisms that basically what they said was you have to go outside and be in the garden or be outside and like it'll come into the little cuts on your hands and you'll inhale it and you'll touch your mouth and you'll eat a little bit of it and that's all you need and you need to do it periodically. Hey, guess what? We need to go out in nature. Like, I feel like it's sort of sad we need to prove it, but we're proving it. And it actually is really, really important for our brain health and our recovery. Just closing with sunshine. So because I was so happy that, I kind of had a foil for this, but everyone knows about this study, right? This huge study following 30,000 women over 20 years, and they found that women who avoided sun exposure assiduously were twice as likely to die for any reason as those who didn't, meaning sun exposure seemed to be protective. And in another paper that they published, it actually showed the risk was considered to be similar to smoking. Avoiding the sun assiduously is as dangerous as smoking from a statistical standpoint. Why is this? Well, I mean, we have a lot of benefits, obviously, from the sun, and people thought, oh, it's like vitamin D. They didn't even think it was vitamin D only. And there's a lot of other studies that support this. This is not the only one, but this was huge. Are there any dermatologists here? They get so angry when I present this study. But basically, right, and even if we're thinking about mold, we want full spectrum light, right? I mean, we're talking now about red light therapy as being this hugely beneficial thing that stimulates the mitochondria to function better and so on. Blue light also is really important, and it's kind of demonizing, as we love to do. We're demonizing blue light, and everyone's wearing like these light blocking glasses and whatever, but really we need blue light, and it happens to be that helps people recover from mold by stimulating the porphyrins, it's fungal porphyrins basically, and causing a lot of oxidative stress to them, and that causes them to die more easily. So we need that. We also need the sun because of UVB radiation, which if you get it in your eyes a little bit, meaning you're not wearing sunglasses, then it's actually going to increase melanocyte-stimulating hormone, which is low in people who have had mold exposure. So you do need to get it in the eyes, but actually that's very important and can really be helpful with the symptoms of mold exposure. Obviously vitamin D, because not everybody tolerates taking it orally. So, and then other things related to sun and heat is sweating. We need to sweat in order to detoxify from everything, especially from mold. And as well, so using heat in a sauna kind of setting is a way of imitating getting that kind of intense sweating response with the light response. But like, I'm not saying it's exactly the same to spend a lot of time in the sun, but I mean, we're getting a lot of benefits from the sun. We just have to do it safely, which means don't get sunburned, basically. And there's ways of building that up. I mean, if a little bit of time in the sun is all you can take, then it's a little bit of time. But the data kind of shows that chronic daily sun exposure is beneficial in most cases, and protective, in fact, even from cancer. I'm going to summarize these slides, which is that nature enhances healing. If you're post-op, looking at trees out the window versus a brick wall, you're going to have a shorter stay, you're going to need less meds, you're going to get out of the hospital, you're going to have less complaints in the nurse's notes. That's a big deal, okay? And you don't need drugs as much. You don't need pain-reducing drugs. It makes you feel better if you're in the dentist's office. If you even see a mural or a picture of trees, your anxiety is going to be lower. Focus is better. Children who play on highly natural playgrounds versus like more turf, or cement playgrounds will have better cognitive and physical functioning, fewer attention and concentration issues. They perform better on tests. And then exercise, right? Just being outdoors and moving actually helps with hormesis. So sweating, again, I'm mentioning deep breathing is part of movement, right? We need to move, we need to stimulate the lymphatics, and that, like, the lymphatics don't have any way of being pumped. I mean, it's hydraulic. We need to do it. We need to do the work. That's doing breathing, deep breathing, and moving our bodies, doing lymphatic drainage kinds of techniques like dry brushing, and then temperature shifts. Who uses that with patients? Hot, cold showers. So that's like an amazing way to kind of help with it is basically stimulating lymphatic drainage. Finally, forest medicine. So it stimulates us from a parasympathetic nervous system standpoint. And parasympathetic nervous system, we know, controls heart rate and respiratory rate, but it also actually modulates our level of inflammation in a second-to-second way, just like breathing and heart rate. And in addition to that, it also, being in nature, and this has been studied extensively because forest bathing or Shinrin-yoku has been studied a lot in Japan as a very common practice, actually improves mood and sleep and cognition and all these things, but as well actually increases natural killer cell activity and expression of anti-cancer proteins. So it actually has measurable objective benefits to our immune system being out in the forest periodically. So we can enjoy being in the forest even without our phones. And that's it. That's my dog. He likes to get dirty too. Thank you.